Hello, and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. Introducing RudderStack Profiles. RudderStack Profiles takes the SAS guesswork and SQL gruntwork out of building complete customer profiles so you can quickly ship actionable, enriched data to every downstream team. You specify the customer traits, then Profiles runs the joins and computations for you to create complete customer profiles. Get all of the details and try the new product today at dataengineeringpodcast.com/RudderStack. You shouldn't have to throw away the database to build with fast-changing data. You should be able to keep the familiarity of SQL and the proven architecture of cloud warehouses, but swap the decades-old batch computation model for an efficient incremental engine to get complex queries that are always up to date. With Materialize, you can. It's the only true SQL streaming database built from the ground up to meet the needs of modern data products. Whether it's real-time dashboarding and analytics, personalization and segmentation, or automation and alerting, Materialize gives you the ability to work with fresh, correct, and scalable results, all on a familiar SQL interface. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/materialize today to get 2 weeks free. Your host is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Ranjith Raghunath about tactical elements of a data product strategy. So Ranjith, can you start by introducing yourself?
Absolutely. Firstly, Tobias, thanks for the opportunity to have me and as a delegate of CX Data Labs on your podcast, a big fan. So thank you. So my name is Ranjith Raghunath. I'm a managing principal over at a company called CX Data Labs. We're a data and analytics strategy and implementation services company, and we focus on optimizing customer experiences in the retail, life sciences, and financial services verticals, using data engineering and data platform as our core set of picks and shovels, effectively to kind of tie these systems together so that businesses can see a holistic view of the customer and then action on it. And some of the things that they do as a result of the work that we've done is increase their ability to personalize on certain content that they present, or better understand their marketing spend in terms of what resonates well with customer acquisition costs, or simply optimizing wait times as people call into a call center. And so those are some of the examples. And for me personally, this has been a long time coming, and I've been in the data and analytics field for roughly 17 years. I've done nothing but various forms of engineering, software, and data, all under the vicinity of either producing data solutions or data products. And just an overall geek, and then a nerd as it comes to data.
And do you remember how you first got started working in data?
Yeah, I do. I do. I was an intern over at a company called USAA, and they were working on a bill back model. And the core problem that they were trying to solve was they had a set of infrastructure that they wanted to go through and bill back all the way to the business teams utilizing those applications so that they were getting value from it. And one of my tasks was to come in and help the team go through and provide this costing model. And so as I came in, they were using Excel and they were using Access and to do some of these computations. And I kind of looked at it and I said, hey, what if we start writing data pipelines to do this? Which I didn't know they were called data pipelines. By the way, I was an electrical engineering graduate coming in as an intern. All I knew is, well, maybe we can optimize it and do it differently. And then soon got introduced to dimensional modeling and said facts and dimensions is how you can do that. Oh, well, what if we why are we sending these reports to them? Can we bring them over and then have them take a look at it, self-service reporting with business intelligence? So a lot of it, I didn't have the names for it per se, but that's how I started cutting my teeth into it and just started kind of navigating it, all to optimize and to kind of lower the ratio in terms of the work done for people getting the value that they need.
Yeah, it's amazing how much in the technology industry in particular, but probably any industry really, that if you don't know the right terms that people are using, then you just end up rebuilding it yourself because you didn't know that it was already done.
100%, 100%. And a lot of it also is the thing that I've always loved about data and data analytics is it's an objective way to make decisions. It also provides some eye-opening opportunities when you put things in front of people and say, hey, these are the observations, right? I mean, we could debate how we use it and what that means in the context of the scenario, but this is what we're observing, right? And oftentimes in the real world, if you contrast that experience, we both could be seeing the same events, but we could be interpreting it very differently. And in the data and analytics world, we have observations and we can see that, and then we have inferences that we can draw on it, but we have that dissected framework to lean on. So that's another kind of thing that has always motivated me to kind of be a discipline, be a disciple of the field, so to speak.
And to that point of shared definitions, shared vocabulary, before we get too far into the conversation at hand today of data product strategies, let's just start by identifying a shared understanding of what we mean when we say data products and how those might differ from data assets like a dashboard or a table or a report that gets delivered quarterly, and what is necessary, what are the surrounding attributes for a piece of data or a grouping of data for it to be qualified as a product?
Sure. And I mean, there's probably multiple definitions around it, so I'm going to give you my rendition of what that means. And so the disclaimer here is, it is not the definition, but it's a perspective and a point of view. When I think about a product is it services a need that a customer has, or a certain segment of people that fit into a persona, right? So you have a need, and then there is an outlay for that need, and it gets serviced. And the way that it gets serviced is through a set of features, and then you have different set of products that help you get to the end of job that you may have for a particular experience that you want to deliver. So okay, all of that sounds very nebulous, but what does that mean in the context of data? You use the word data asset. For me, an asset means something that you can harness value from and log transactions against. So there's a cost, and then there's revenue that comes in. A data asset, as you talked about, is a type of data product. A dashboard is a type of data product. A model is also a type of data product. And so these are interfaces that you have customers use to harness value and then also assimilate costs across it, right? For me, simply put, a data product is thinking about the customer and then the way that they use data and its attributes to make decisions, and cataloging them into a set of features that you can then have expanded teams put together that deliver it, but then can also have long runtime roadmaps that you kind of can nurture and then kind of grow over time. So what does that mean? So let's say that we say that we're going to build a C360 data asset, right? So we're going to break that down and try to identify the different features that we would need to correctly depict what a customer would be, and we would think about it in a product. So what does that mean? A product has a life cycle. It has release notes, it has releases, it has a team that's long lived that goes through and produces this. We also take care of regressions. We also take care of things that we may need to deprecate over time. We may think of features that add on to these different modules. And so thinking about that 363 customer 360 data asset as a product, and then putting together a release roadmap that says these are the features that are coming out in this quarter, who's going to be first, who's going to be a technology evangelist versus an adventure enthusiast. Those could be multiple variables that come in, and they could be spread across two different releases. And so I look at the concept of a data product as one that builds on top of each other and really thinks about the customer and the way they use it and how they use it, and provides them with interfaces so that it's easier for them to use. So the last thing that I'll say before I hand it back over to you is the usage modality here could be that we would like to give a customer ID, and we would like to get to know if this person is a technology enthusiast or not. And the best way to do that may be consuming that data set through a RESTful interface where it has a certain set of specifications in the term of a contract, so that I can go through and enable real-time decision making. Great. That's an interface into an asset that we have, culminating into a product that we go through and sell. They could be other interfaces to it, which is, hey, I want to consume all of these records in batch and then make decisions and go through and drive it. Well, that's another interface, again, into the same asset. So it's just breaking this concept of data usage and what it means into a set of constructs that we just kind of talked about.
And so, with that shared definition of what it means to have a data product, what are the pieces that we need to strategize about? Why do we need a strategy? What purpose does that strategy serve? And how does that inform the work to be done?
Very good. Very good. It's a good question because this is something that I think about quite a bit. We talked about different types of data products. We talked about type model. We talked about type dashboard. We talked about type data asset. You can have further categories like information asset as well. And so if you were to hydrate these into or condense these into patterns, then you start taking a look at a value chain that comes from a set of activities when done in unison produce an artifact, right? That being a data asset. Okay, so then the thinking here is you have patterns, you have a set of activities that line up to these patterns, and you have a set of artifacts that are produced as a result of that. Effectively, what we think of when we say a data product strategy is the formulation of that so that we can go through and industrialize its production, right? So that from the concept of inception all the way to industrialization, you can utilize this op model, so to speak, to kind of produce this artifact in a very streamlined way. Okay. So what does that mean? You're producing a data set. Let's just say it's a data asset that you're producing. Let's go back to the other example of customer 360. In order for you to source that information, you may need to go to a CRM system. And that CRM system, let's just say it's Salesforce. The ingestion pattern associated with ingesting data from Salesforce doesn't need to be recreated again and again for sourcing, let's say, from one entity such as contact or another entity such as account. You define the pattern of the ingestion once, and then you go through and leverage that highway, so to speak, for different objects as they come along. And so you slowly start condensing those set of patterns into broader capabilities, and then you free up the development cycle for producing these products and hone in on these capabilities, right? And so effectively what you end up doing is you make the marginal cost of producing the next product simpler and simpler. And so effectively you harden these set of capabilities, right? And so that's kind of that whole piece of the puzzle is we produce and develop a strategy, and that's why you need one. Otherwise, what ends up happening if you don't have one is the cost of producing a product is just the same or expensive again and again and again, right? And so what you want to do is you want that cost curve to come down. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah. And for those elements of defining or establishing what the strategy should be, who is responsible for guiding that process? Who are the people that need to be involved from a kind of roles and persona perspective? And what are the things that might trigger the development of a given strategy?
Yeah, yeah. So I think you always got to start off with the consumers of analytics in mind. So they're very important stakeholders. These are the folks who consume the analytics being produced and action on it. So think about somebody in the office of the CIO. Think about a chief credit risk officer who takes a look at the analytics being produced and says, "Hey, this is my overall risk for my portfolio within the sector that I manage. This is how I can curtail my bookends with respect to certain hedges that I'm performing." But that's a cohort, right? That's a segment of the population that provides you with, hey, here's what I'm going to do with the analytics that you provide me, and this is what I decision on and action on, and oh, by the way, this is why I need what this is. And that typically for us is use cases, right? And they come from our stakeholders, and the stakeholders kind of closer in the business that go through and drive that out. Those needs and that level of dialogue that goes on that says, where in this business process do you actually embed this level of analytics? How do you use it? What is the time taken for you to go through and provide it? Is there any sensitivity to the information being provided? All of those kinds of questions and answers that need to kind of bring the use case to life in our world is brought together through the lens of a data product manager. And in some organizations, that could be further bolstered with a product owner that's a little bit more tactical, kind of taking those needs and helping them kind of see the technical definitions around it, or it's fully owned by the product manager themselves. And then what we have is we have a set of software data engineering managers who kind of sort of go through and break this down in terms of, hey, here's what the needs means in the way of thinking about non-functionals. How do these come into play? And that's where we really see the software engineering managers, data engineering managers come in. They got to hear the functional needs and then start saying, well, here are the non-functionals. This is what we need to do. Okay, well, we're going to produce it in this way. We should have some logging measures being put into place. We need to have some telemetry. We need to have some monitoring. And then they also take all of the needs being articulated and put them into functional requirements, and then they start breaking them down. And the breaking them down part really is where we see, TPMs or Scrum Masters, or however you want to call them, but effectively folks who can take a set of functional requirements, a set of non-functional requirements, and then kind of devise them into a plan of action that the team can execute on. And then you have a set of developers, right? Now they fit into multiple different brackets. It could be platform engineers, it could be data engineers, it could be software engineers, but they all kind of listen to these needs that have been kind of dissected into stories, and they start saying, okay, well, this is, if we do this, then we can achieve this. Do you agree with this? And that whole negotiation going back and forth happens internally to the team, and then also with the product manager, and then ultimately signed off by the software development manager or the data engineering manager. And then it gets formulated into a set of release artifacts that we go through and produce and provide out, that ultimately gets embedded into the business workflow. Now, all of this stuff is going to be useless if we don't have a really good business enablement, customer success driven viewpoint in which we're doing change management both on the technology side, but then also on the business side, which is now you're going to get this new analytical, component. How are you going to use it? So, for example, let's say there's a propensity for failure of paying back a loan. How are you going to use it when you make the loan origination decision? When should you pull the lever, right, to say this model doesn't make sense, these answers don't make sense? And oh, by the way, how do you tune it, right? Where do we monitor that? And how do you make decisions on it? So it's a combination, right, of different items coming together along with different roles, and they encompass all the way from change managers, right? Sometimes these are played by the product manager, and then some analytical translators or folks or business analysts directly in the business. It just really depends on the company that you're in and the role that they play. But then those are all the kind of left to right kind of side of the equations that would look like to kind of produce a data product, and the different activities that would go into it.
This episode is brought to you by Datafold, a testing automation platform for data engineers that finds data quality issues before the code and data are deployed to production. Datafold leverages data diffing to compare production and development environments and column-level lineage to show you the exact impact of every code change on data, metrics, and BI tools, keeping your team productive and stakeholders happy. Datafold integrates with dbt, the modern data stack, and seamlessly plugs in your data CI for team-wide and automated testing. If you are migrating to a modern data stack, Datafold can also help you automate data and code validation to speed up the migration. Learn more about Datafold by visiting dataengineeringpodcast.com/Datafold today. And regardless of whether you actively engage in defining and implementing a particular strategy, there's always going to be a strategy. It's just a matter of whether you are explicit and purposeful about it, or if it is just something that is emergent. And I'm curious what you have seen as some of the juxtaposition of teams that are very deliberate about the definition and execution of a product strategy for their data assets versus teams that just leave it to, well, this is what we're doing, it'll just emerge and we'll figure it out as we go kind of approach.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think so I think when you have very product centric teams that are exclusively focused on enabling, let's say, a product that they're going through and releasing, and they have analytics as a tie-in to that product, I see them leveraging and kind of latching on to the product strategy itself, and analytics and data kind of sort of, they don't fall by the wayside, but they're secondary actors within that overall equation, right? Which means what? You typically have one business intelligence engineer, you have one data engineer that's within the group, and their entire purpose of existence is to help the product manager rationalize decisions based on either funding, customer decisioning journey, churn, whatever it may be, ARR, whatever it is that they want to do, the flavor of the day is what they work on, right? So in that case, they're not really coming up for air as much and thinking about and saying, hey, here are the 14 or 15 different questions that I get asked. Here's how I can start laying out the foundation so that I don't need to do the same amount of work that I do for answering those 14 different questions. Let me start formulating and sourcing data that will create these core entities that I can then use to mash up. And oh, by the way, let me build a dashboard on top of it so that the product manager can do it themselves, right? So that side of the equation is where I see less of that, and it's more where the product is center, and the product manager are driving all of the kind of work and centering it on the product itself, right? So I don't see a strategy that coherently kind of describes anything in scenarios like that. Where I've seen companies use or kind of dive in really into data product strategy is where there is a focus on building data products, but there's an aspect of doing it in a centralized fashion. And it could be, it's not that everything is centralized, but it could be that a core set of the infrastructure is centralized, a core set of the assets being brought in are centralized. So what does that mean? Let's go back to the example that I gave about Salesforce, right? It's a CRM system. Okay. It's got a ton of assets within it. Okay. What does that mean? It's got contact, it's got account, it's got leads. There's leads that are being qualified there. There are sales. There's tons of information there. Do we want every single team to go through and source that information again and again and again? Probably not. I mean, if you think about it on an ingress and egress perspective, it doesn't make sense. So you have a set of teams that go through and say, hey, here, we're going to model how to particularly use contact and account and the relationships between it, and we're going to manifest it in a place that makes it easy for teams to go through and soup and source it. Okay. Well, when they do that, they're effectively centralizing that capability of data ingest and data rationalization. So when you're a consumption driven team coming through, you have to learn that mnemonic and you have to go forward. So in cases like that, where people are looking for efficiency gain through central harmonization of data, I see those kinds of companies do data product strategy more and more, right? And then the tier that sits in the middle is where they don't necessarily agree on the centralization or the decentralization, but they agree a ton on the ways of working and the standardization of the ways of working, right? So if you think about, hey, what does continuous integration look like? In the concept of data engineering, what does continuous deployment look like, and what does that mean? And so if you have teams that are really software focused, but then are trying to enable data products, they hedge on the ways of working. They say, hey, well, let's have a repo structure that's conducive to working on data engineering efforts. So they go through and drive out a set of standardization there, and that's hedged on kind of what is a data product and how do we enable that. So those are the three kind of verticals that I see as I've kind of scavenged the field.
You mentioned the different roles and responsibilities throughout the process of designing and implementing a product strategy. But of course, not every company is going to have the same sets of people, the same titles, or even a given title might not even exist across separate people. And I'm curious how you have seen the size and structure of different teams, both within and adjacent to the data capabilities, influence the ways that people approach the concept of how to strategize, what the scope of a given product looks like, etc.
Yeah, and I think this really depends on verticals and the kind of vertical that you belong to, and the importance given to data within that vertical. So if you take a look at the insurance business, they've been using data to make decisions for a very, very long time. So their maturity around data management and the need for it, right, is super high, because when you make rate changes on insurance policies, you need to file with the state. So guess what? Like, you automatically are thinking about data retention. You're all automatically are thinking about the governance around the data that's used to make those decisions. You're automatically thinking about the fact that you have a deadline to submit these things, and you have SLAs in place. Okay, well, they need to be done in a particular order so that it can go through and be deployed. Every, like, if you take an actuarial scientist, right, like, there's a particular way that they go through and do their business. So there's a certain hygiene around the way that they think about processing the data so that they can then answer the questions that they seek. So based on the vertical that you're in, or the industry vertical that you're in, and the importance that data has within its relevance, right, will dictate how much you think about data and how much you think about all of the illities that come with it. And so in the insurance example that I gave you, they inherently have a strategy, but it's embedded in the way that the vertical exists. So you may not need a business analyst. You could have an actuarial scientist, or maybe a junior one who functions as one. And they write documents, they write requirements in the sense that depicts the process flow where things need to happen or not. And so that's one example, right? Another example you could have, and they may need to have separation of roles because they're probably in a regulated business where the person doing the math cannot be the one that checks the math, and therefore the way that they've kind of written these rules says we need to physically have them as being separate so as to guarantee a level of quality that they go through and drive out. This is that way in the life sciences business, for example, right? There's a large focus on QC because imagine you getting a drug that hasn't been QC'd as much as it should have. So there's a certain set of operating protocols and procedures that have been grounded on mitigating risk and increasing quality, and that's kind of led to an op model where you have different people doing a different set of roles, and that's dictating the way that the industry operates and drives. So that's another vector, right? Which is the industry drives the kind of roles based on the way that they segment things. The third is where data is used as an enabler, but the cost of getting it wrong is not that high, and you need it for directional correctness rather than exactness, right? So in the example of life sciences, or even in cyber, right, like or in security, you cannot get things right on average. Those things don't happen in those verticals, right? You have to get it right every single time. Versus in retail, for example, right? You're less likely to give your address to a person who says, "Hey, can I get your address right at the checkout desk?" Versus, like you're within a financial services institution and they asking you what your address is so that they can send you statements. I guarantee you, one has a higher likelihood of you giving the most accurate information compared to the other. So you get a ton of garbage in, right? In some of these verticals, like for example, in retail. So then you start saying, okay, well, you're gonna have to formulate a ton of rules to get it right, and so you start to say, okay, well, there's a lot of definition here. There isn't a lot of criteria that we put on the docket. We just need to do a ton of iterations and go through and get the answer right. So what I've seen in industries like that is you don't have a ton of roles. You have one developer, one solution that goes deep, right? They may do the business intelligence reporting. They may do the data engineering. They may also help the business in doing the governance itself by flagging elements that are out of sync or out of place. So this is a very long-winded way to say, Tobias, like depending on the industry vertical that you're in and the place that data has in the relevance of the decision-making process and the kind of inputs that they get, high quality versus not, the cost of getting it wrong versus being directionally correct, all define the number of roles that are being put in place. So it's almost like a spectrum, right? So that's kind of one way to take a look at it. And so now, what is the commonality that you see regardless of the industry that you're in? I think it comes down to the artifacts. Regardless of how many roles you have and which industry that you're in, a technique that I've seen work well, at least from my perspective, when you formulate these kinds of strategies is a set of interviews with stakeholders. These are people typically who are making decisions using the analytics that you're providing, taking those set of use cases, boiling that up into a set of capabilities that need to be invested in, dissecting that, building programs which have projects within it that then get executed on, that then kind of tie into metrics that say this is why we did what we did and this is the value that we're going to get. And oh, by the way, through that process, this is the data sets that we're governing and this is how we're governing it without maybe using those words is what I've seen work well. And it also disarms organizations because many times, when you go in and you say, hey, we're going to stand up like the outcome of a data product strategies is a team that we need to build up of like 50 people. In an organization that doesn't have data within the decision making nomenclature, right? That's going to be a tough one to stomach. But even in one that is driven in that way, 50 is a large number. They're going to balk anyways, and they're going to say, "Well, we're getting efficiency with one person. Why would we need to do it differently?" So I think just focusing on the artifacts and really thinking about how do you take these use cases, hydrate that up into into a set of portfolio and programs that you can execute on wrapped around with metrics and governance is the way to go, regardless of who does it.
The other interesting element of data products is the audience, where because data has so many different potential stakeholders and consumers that will drastically influence the overall user experience that you're trying to optimize for, because the core element of something being a product is that it is consumable out of the box versus just here's some data, good luck, you can pull it from this S3 bucket if you want. As a product, you go to like a Netflix, that's a product. You go to Amazon, that's a product for e-commerce. If you are a data consumer, and if I give you a CSV file and I'm an average person who is just trying to answer a question, what is the CSV file going to do for me? But if I have a search box where I can type a question and then you're using that underlying data to give an answer, then that's a better experience. Whereas if I'm a data engineer and you give me a CSV and a little bit of documentation, what to do with it. And so I'm curious, what are some of the useful questions that teams need to be asking in the development of that product strategy that will inform the implementation details and the types of technologies that they need to bring to bear on the solution?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for kind of highlighting the importance that interfaces play in the role of a data product. So I think one of the things that you kind of mentioned and the examples that you gave about Netflix and Amazon and everything else is, let's just take the example of maybe Amazon, right? You come in, you search for a product and you buy it, right? But why did you search for that product? You had a need. Let's say you're buying a household, you're buying a household cleaner, right? Going in there and you're trying to search for something because you want to clean your house, right? And you want to do it in a self-sufficient way that, you want to buy a product, put that on the floor so that you drive full. Okay, well, there's different choices that you have, But the point I'm trying to make is that whole concept of Amazon and search is in the context of a need that the customer has in the life cycle that they're in, that this fits into, right? And so what does that mean in the context of data products? As we start collecting these use cases, a big thing that we do and we emphasize on is how are they going to be used, and how often are they going to be used, and in what context are they going to be used, right? So for example, like if someone says I need this information, let's say that they produced a propensity score for that person's ability to either default or not on a loan. I need it within 5 seconds, right? Every 5 seconds it needs to be refreshed. My question always is, let's say that I give it to you in 4 seconds. What are you going to do with the 1 second that you save? Right? Let's say I'm going to do that. What are you going to do in the next 5 seconds before the data comes in? And it leads to very interesting conversations, because what effectively you're trying to unravel is what's next. Like, what do you do next? Right? In the context of the Amazon example that you gave, well, okay, I take it, and then that spray comes home, and then I clean my table with it. Okay. Okay. Well, that's good. Then what do you do? Well, yeah, and then I store it, right? Okay. Well, in the context of data products, like, in the context of the example that I gave you, well, I'll take that output that you provide, and then I make a decision on it. Well, what do you do with that decision? Well, very quickly in the flow of the application, the loan origination application, the customer is going to be able to see if they got a yes or no in terms of the loan that they were asking for, because I take this variable and I weight that by 70%, because I heavily weight this to say, if this is a yes or no, it kind of determines if they get the loan or not. Oh, wow. Okay, that's interesting. So now you start walking backwards from there and you start saying, okay, well, a CSV file probably won't scale for that. How are you going to do a reach in for this? Well, hey, we typically, like within the application flow that we have, we use RESTful interfaces for doing everything that, we go through and go through and drive out. Okay. Well, all right. So now you start saying, okay, well, now we need to start using APIs. Okay. They need to be discoverable. Well, like what kind of validation do you do on this to make sure that it isn't something that's so wild? What happens as a result of that? Okay, well then as you start having these conversations with your customer in the way that they are going to be using that analytics, you start formulating the interfaces that they're going to be used, or channels that they're going to use to soup up the intelligence that you're providing, whether it's core data or insights or information, knowledge, you name it, that's what it is, right? And so that starts to formulate the way that you start providing these interfaces, and the same data set or information asset or data asset, these different types of data products could have multiple channels, right? For example, one of the things here could be that, in the context of the persona that you gave, right, of a data engineer, they could be wanting that data set through an S3 interface, like something that they can consume in batch and then do some reconciliation on. So the way that the consumer utilizes it in the context of the decision making will dictate the interfaces. And those interfaces is what we build that then says, hey, here's the product that we're building. Here's how we deliver it to you so that you can consume it. What are your consumption patterns? And you got to keep that front and center as you're walking it through, because the last mile optimization on that is driven off of those items. And there's some interesting nuances as well, right? In the last mile consumption piece, you're less worried about duplication. You're less worried about, oh my God, am I copying this data or am I copying this in 14 different ways? You're more worried about, is the interface optimal for the consumption, right? Versus optimal for storage and distribution.
As more people start using AI for projects, two things are clear. It's a rapidly advancing field, and it's tough to navigate. How can you get the best results for your use case? Instead of being subjected to a bunch of buzzword bingo, hear directly from pioneers in the developer and data science space on how they use graph tech to build AI-powered apps. Attend the Dev and ML Talks at Nodes 2023, a free online conference on October 26th featuring some of the brightest minds in tech. Check out the agenda and register today at neo4j.com/nodes. That's NEO, the number 4, j.com/NODES. I'm curious how technical debt factors into the overall process of the development and consideration around what the strategy is and how to approach implementation, both in terms of I already have this existing technical debt, and so that constrains the available set of capabilities that I have, or it will extend the delivery timeline, but also this is the strategy that I want to implement. This is the timeline I'm committing to. So now I need to consciously take on this additional technical debt. I'm just curious how that plays out in the overall process.
It's a good question. And I say that only because we all accumulate technical debt, and I haven't quite seen to the extent that I would like to, out in the wild, including when I used to be on the other side of the fence, like leading data teams in corporations, both in tech and non-tech, do it well, right? And so here's one of the ways that I've seen get close to doing it well. It's really negotiating a percentage of your execution backlog to be dedicated to technical debt that the engineering team has accountability for in terms of prioritizing so that the overall cost of delivery comes down. So what does that mean? In the backlog, you could have net new features, bug fixes, and technical debt all be commingled. And so what we've seen work well is you take about 30% of that backlog and you say, hey, we're going to dedicate this to technical debt, and we're going to give the accountability to the data engineering managers or the software engineering managers to go through and drive it. They prioritize it, they put it on there so that you go through and see it, you go through and move it accordingly. The product managers should be able to see if they're doing a good job of it or not by tracking the overall cost of production and operating and maintenance costs associated with the product itself, right? So the lower amount of tech debt that you have, I think you can see it in a couple of different ways. One is your O&M costs are going to go lower, right? Yeah, and typically, O&M costs, operating and maintenance costs are roughly in the 50% mark. So if you can bring that down by 20, right, and kind of bring it even into 30, or if you're super optimal into the 15% range, that's a good indicator that you're resolving your tech debt as much as you can. The other nascent thing to look at is attrition. When you have a really poorly built product, and it's going to be tough for you to maintain people on the operating and maintenance side of the equation to go through and drive that out. So that's one other side of the equation. The other thing that I've seen work really well is in terms of tech debt, because when people go through and provide these strategies or even these patterns and drive them out, at that point in time, they were probably the best and the greatest. But like over time, like anything else, everything deteriorates, right? Technology is moving at a faster clip rate. So having a dedicated time during your execution mechanism, like one sprint out of seven, right? in a classic PI type setting with agile, safe agile, could be one where you kind of take a step back and you allow the practitioners on the floor, right, who are driving stuff forward, who are actually the ones that are closest to the pain, to say, hey, like there are these new ways of building things. Can we go through and try and implement them and see where they go, right? And that kind of raises the bar in terms of making sure that not just tech debt stays in check, but then you're innovating. In some cases, what I've seen is teams completely stop delivery of net new features, and saying that, you know what, the way that we're going to resolve this is we're going to take care of all the bugs, right? So we're going to have something called a bug bash, and then take that completely down, right? Maybe they do, like a month long worth effort there, and then they go through and throttle their backlog, so to speak, so to make sure that they can get back in line. So these are different ways that I've seen teams go through and manage this concept of tech debt. And then the last thing that I'll mention is, the concept that I talked about, use cases being hydrated up into a set of patterns, and these patterns kind of going into capabilities. It's really important to kind of go through and score those capabilities on a yearly basis to say, how well are we doing, right? And sanitize that and say, and that's another way to measure architecture as well. And that I have yet to see teams do a good job in, because they just don't think of architecture and scoring the architecture in that way. Someone writes a blueprint, it's super high level, somebody goes through and implements it, and we never score those capabilities. Like, for example, how is our data ingestion capabilities? Is it a 9 out of 10? Why is it a 9 out of 10? Well, guess what, folks? We can't ingest TSVs. Okay. How important is it? Do we have any use cases that go through to that? Well, yeah, we do. We have five out of 20 use cases that are doing that. Okay. Well, how much time are we spending as a result of that? Well, our sprint points are X, for these kinds of things. That kind of telemetry, walking that backwards and then saying, hey, this is how we score architecture. I haven't seen that as much in the wild, if any. But I think that's another way to kind of score your architecture based on the capabilities that you've driven, and to make sure that these tech debt items kind of get brought to the surface.
And circling back on the interface of the products, there's also the question of customer education, of how much context and how much familiarity do they need to have of the data, of the statistical aspects of that data, in order to be able to use it to effectively make decisions, or is the understanding that they're reaching actually accurate based on their background? And I'm wondering how you've seen teams try to approach that element of delivering the data product, delivering the guardrails or surrounding capabilities, so that the end user is able to actually effectively make use of that product without having to have somebody sitting beside them saying, okay, this is what you need to know. These are the steps to actually use this thing. These are the other things that you need to do after the fact, etc.
Good question. I'll start off with the story, right? And I think all of us will be very familiar with this one. That number is incorrect. And they're like, why is that number incorrect? Because the person did the roll up in the wrong way. Okay, well, it was obvious that the column was there, so I ended up rolling it up. Well, what you didn't do is you didn't apply a filter, because this other column actually, you had to apply a filter for this column and then do an aggregation, and then you'll get the right number. Because effectively, what you've done right now is you've made it 10x the number that it is. And so these kinds of stories, right? I've genericized it, but these kinds of stories are pervasive. Like, all of us have heard it, right? And so if you think about it, and so it's saying, well, how did that come to fruition? People think just because you have the data, you can just kind of give it out, and not knowing the persona group that the person belongs to, and how the consumption experience has been defined for that persona. You'll often hear people say, hey, just give me access to the data, I'll figure it out, and oftentimes you end up with stories like this. So I've seen well and done well, and kind of something that we practice and both preach, is that the interface that sits on top of the data needs to walk backwards from the set of questions that we're trying to answer. What are the kind of roll ups that we're trying to do? What is it that we need to do in order to make sure that we put a definition around the roll ups so that it's relevant? What are the filter conditions that are relevant for those roll ups versus not? And in this particular instance, I'm talking strictly about dashboards, so that you have those items outlined, so that when people come through and consume this, the the number of toggles or inputs that you can use, that you can get an outcome with, is limited, so that you can go through and drive that out. And so that level of metering is super, super important. Now, on the other aspect of educating the user about the data and what it means, what I've seen, like specifically in the modeling arena, is boundary conditions and self throttling even before you get the results out, right? To say, hey, this kind of breaches are out of bound conditions, and therefore, this needs a second set of review. What I have seen work the worst is a ton of very detailed documents, spanning multiple pages that exactly explains what that is, or in fact, even a user session, that every time you get on board, I sit with you and I walk you through what that means. That's another thing that I don't see used very well. So our preference and what we typically like to do is a set of tests that are run to make sure that the data that you're actually consuming is accurate and of high quality and of integrity. And then on the consumption side, really limiting the inputs to the outputs, right? Like if there's a country where they don't use zip code, or they use another form of zip code, then don't show that option, just limiting it considerably and then lining that up to the questions that you're asking.
And in your experience of working in this space of helping data teams understand what is the customer experience that they're trying to satisfy, how can they actually go about delivering those capabilities? What are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you have seen teams either go through the process of developing and executing a given strategy, or some of the most interesting formulations of that strategy that you've seen?
Yeah, I think like when we think about customer experience, right? Let's just kind of ground ourselves a little bit on the definition of how we bring that to life. The inputs to customer experience is really kind of taking a look at your business and saying these are the different touch points that our customers produce as they interact with our digital as well as our analog real estate. And so right there, you can take the analog real estate out, and you pretty much have the digital real estate, and you say, okay, well, these are the different interaction points that we have. All right. So now that we have that, we use those as the input to then drive decisions, and that then the customer experiences. And that whole process could be, how do we optimize the loan origination process for the lowest number of clicks, right, to get to a decision? It could be, how do we make sure that Tobias gets the most relevant content that gets presented on his screen so that he quickly makes a decision on buying a product that is relevant to their need, right? So what I'm trying to get at is the way that I've seen teams do a really, really good job of that is asking the question as to what is the core metric that we need to hedge on that clearly defines, is the customer experience optimal or not? Is it the number of clicks? Is it the time taken per page? Is it the number of items that he's left on a basket? What is that? Data teams, and I haven't seen many data teams do it, but I've seen a lot of business intelligence teams do it, which is they really, really anchor and they ask the question as to what is the metric that we need to be really optimizing for, and getting that formulated, getting that listed out accurately and done well, right? The next thing from there that I have seen data teams do well is take that and think about all of the data elements that come through and formulate that answer and start putting in early signs of failure, right? So, for example, in order to determine the number of clicks, we get that from 5 different systems. And we know that this one system, when we get it from that one system, we have to make sure that the integrity and the quality is extremely high. Okay. But we produce this on a weekly basis. Should we flag this at the end of the week? Or can we flag this as and when the data is coming in to say, hey, this is out of bounds and this doesn't make any sense? There's a new ordinal value that we need to flag. Oh, these two systems are no longer in sync because our join criteria are going to be off. And oh, by the way, now this is going to lead to a massive skew. So to summarize, where I've seen data teams do really, really well is build those capabilities around observability and monitoring. And for me, there are two distinct things. Monitoring is the things that you actually know that you can monitor for. And then observability is everything else that you see coming through the panacea that you're able to kind of decipher and kind of understand. And then using machine learning almost to help you understand the patterns and behaviors, the slow drift that's going on. And relying less on the operational systems to tell you where the problems are. Because the operational systems, if they have issues going on, they can easily flag it. But otherwise, they kind of go through and drive whatever it is that they need to do, and they can kind of go through and keep producing the results, right? So having a lot of that infrastructure built on the data engineering side to drive that out is where I've seen data engineering teams innovate and excel, right? Because the alternate is, oh, Why don't we see a lot of data teams innovate on the KPI side or pushing the business to think more about that? They don't. It's almost like having the spark plugs define the car. It doesn't work that way. And so I think it's an unfair expectation to have that of data teams. What I think they do really, really well is optimizing on the infrastructure pieces that I mentioned.
And in your experience of working in this space, what are the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
Always question the core set of assumptions coming in. Also, people will hand you over code. I mean, oftentimes what really happens is, you're trying to build an analytics product, and like you're trying to go through and walk all the way back to the source system. You're trying to analyze the data, and you've got people telling you how the data is manifested in these systems, and they will talk about it. They give you these diagrams and all those different things. I think taking a synthetic transaction all the way from the left to the right in terms of, hey, here's how the data originates, this is how it gets manifested in these systems, these are all the assumptions that we're making, these are the edge cases. Documenting all those items and seeing it and living through it, I think is not just key, but it's paramount. Because one of the things that always shocks me is you kind of come in and then, people will say in the operational side, right? They will say, let's just take the example of a trucking company. They'll say, hey, whenever our trucks leave late, our drivers always enter the information. It's a part of our SOP, but we don't see that in the system. And so why don't you see that in the system? Well, the thing is, they tried entering it in this field before. It didn't quite work for them. So they started using the comment field afterwards. So yes, they are doing it, right? So the SOP is still active and relevant. However, and that data is in the system. It's just not where they said that it would be. One of the good mitigation strategies that I've discovered for this is a go out and see and take a walk, with the actual executioners of the process and see what that means. And that's another piece that I also kind of bring to the top of the surface is business process and understanding business process and walking that into where the data is manifested in what operational system and how it's manifested. That top to bottom kind of viewpoint is important so that you can tease these kinds of things out.
And for teams who are starting down the path of trying to incorporate these strategic processes into their delivery workflow, what are the cases where going through the whole process of building a data product strategy, using that as the means to identify and prioritize work to be done is overkill, and you just need to focus on the technical aspects, and that is actually the core capability that you need to deliver?
I think when you're I think when you're fairly small, when I say fairly small, like you've got a team of, let's say, like, you have a team of 5 people, and then you need to kind of provide analytics to the organization, and you formulate and work through it in a solution by solution basis, and that's all that you have. You can still start thinking about data and the concept of a product and defining a strategy, but your throughput or the ammunition that you bring to the table is going to be far less. So you're going to accumulate a ton of technical debt as you go through it. And honestly, in the beginning, it's going to be par for the course, right? So in that case, the team may not think that it's overkill, but your stakeholders may, because the initial cost of you building a data ingestion pattern-based framework that'll automatically auto-ingest data, man, the cost of that initially for a single use case will be extremely high. So my suggestion is for places where you don't have a lot of executive leadership support, i.e., those leaders haven't come from a very strong data background and they can't see the need for it, but need to see hard numbers in the context of a single use case that's very, very myopic, this will be overkill 100%. So then the question is, well, is it still not right for the organization, and what should we do about it? And so I think this is where making sure that as you work through the use cases, you carve out a certain segment of your backlog and use that in a very nuanced way to start building some shared capabilities, right? And so this is kind of the point that I had made earlier about the fact that your acceleration is going to be less, which means you're going to travel. You're not going to travel as fast as you normally would. I think those are par for the course, but that's kind of what I would do in cases like that. And those are the places where this would be overkill, right? In areas where you've got executive support, you've got a set of people around you who actually have seen the need for building data products at scale, and you have multiple teams that are all producing data products of different variety. there may be a big aspiration to provide some of these central capabilities so as to lower the overall cost of production, building the use case for that, showcasing what the ROI looks like, right? And doing something that product managers do day in and day out, right? In organizations like that, right, where you have 50 people all producing products, right, or solutions, so to speak, right, that go through and get serviced by consumers. You could start seeing these kinds of concepts accepted more so than not. Just to summarize, I think it's relevant in either set of organizations, but it's more pertinent, and investments is a lot easier to make where you have a lot of people just working through providing data solutions, and you kind of take a look at it and you said, hey, didn't we just produce that data set like last week? Yeah, that had 4 columns, but this has 5. So why is that other team doing it? Why don't we just kind of take this data set and make it into an asset and then put that on there? And oh, by the way, why don't we put privacy treatments on it as well, because that other team did that too? How do we mix it? Oh, you're spinning up like an S3 bucket in this way, right? Why don't we use Terraform to go through and do that? Oh, well, our standards are different. Well, our naming conventions are different. And so I think these kinds of problems come at scale, right? Because now Tobias can't move from team A to team B, because even though they use the same cloud provider, the way that they do business is different. And so the op model is different. So these are problems at scale versus, in smaller sizes, smaller teams, it's less forgiving because, the telephone problem is not that high.
And for teams and individuals who are trying to upskill into this space of managing data product strategy or understanding how best to integrate it into their work, what are some of the resources that you have found useful and that you recommend people dig into to be able to understand more of the tactical elements of how to bring data product strategy into the work that they're doing for delivering data to their various end consumers?
Really honing in and understanding software development practices and what they mean, I think, is a good space to start off in. So this involves everything from what does CI and CD mean? What does really building services look like? What does contracts mean in this space? API contracts. What does discoverable services look like? And this is very very software engineering oriented. And then that's where I assume there's got to be a little bit of learning, right? Kind of coming to the table. The other part that I think data engineering teams and practitioners currently providing data and analytic solutions will bring to the table by themselves is the inherent nature where data is different. The data assets being produced, information assets being produced, they're different than just core services, right? So how do you think about the op model there? What does that look like? And how do you take these concepts and build them into this? So for us, for example, when we produce a data pipeline, do we have a baseline data set that we can test against every single time, right? How do we measure drift? What does that mean? Should we build leaderboards or not? And then using that kind of set of introspective Q&A to start building out capabilities to say, okay, well, this is what it means, this is what it looks like, and start leveraging and deep diving on those items. That's what I would suggest. Now, tactically, there are a lot of thinkers in this space, right, who have all kind of provided their own perspective on what it means. I mean, ThoughtWorks as a company, I think, has done a ton in the space of data products. Sanjeev Mohan, has done a lot of thinking on the data product space. You've got data contracts with Chad, Sorensen. So I think they're staying close to all of these different vectors coming up is a big one as well. What I found exceptionally helpful is staying close to all the Slack channels, where different people are like really ideating and thinking about what this means. And our space is constantly evolving as well, right? So if you think about metric stores, if you think about the concept of obviously the data mesh and fabric have kind of come to fruition, and different people are working on different things in that arena. But if you think about data observability, if you think about data contracts, so these are all kind of relatively new concepts coming up, right? Over the past 3 years. So they've started to take shape and they've started to take hold, and thinking about how this impacts our space is going to be the biggest one. And for us, what that means is there's a ton of change, right? And so when you are in these Slack channels, whether it's for data quality, whether it's for data observability, provided by Big Eye or any of the other companies, you tend to start hearing people talk about these interdisciplinary concepts and bringing them together. And then obviously, the shameless plug for your own podcast, Tobias. I mean, I think, if you're a data engineer and you're not kind of listening to some of these things, you're probably missing the beat on the trends going on and then kind of incorporating that back into your own set of practices, right? So tactically, those are the places that I would look for.
Are there any other aspects of this space of data product strategy, how to think about it from a tactical perspective, how to incorporate it into your overall work processes that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I think we did touch on it, but let me double click on it further. I think this concept of metrics and really gauging to see if your strategy is headed in the direction that it needs to head is core. When we start thinking about a data product strategy, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what are we going to get as a result of that? Is it going to be lowering the cost of producing products? Is it going to be increasing throughput on capabilities that we already have? Hedging on that and really understanding why and what that means is going to be key and core, right? Also understanding if you're doing this for defense or offense purposes, right? If you're doing this to optimize on cost or you're trying to increase top line, answering those questions initially and kind of grounding yourself in why you're doing what you're doing is going to be super important. Otherwise, this will be just like another flavor of the day. You will be producing solutions and nothing more, and probably at twice the cost and for one half the value.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as the final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
I think the biggest, well, I mean, firstly, I think like there's still the biggest problems that we have is about comprehension of how we use things more than the technologies. But one aspect that I see we completely lack on is this ability to learn from the way that others are using the tooling and the data within the ecosystem that we have, and then making our systems more intelligent. So one of the things that we always think about with respect to data management, right, is it's kind of like being a cartographer. There are many cartographers all throughout your organization that are doing these queries, right, or merging or culling through data and then formulating these side roads. And oftentimes, whenever you start looking at it, they're interpreting how this data is being assimilated together and then creating this map, right, of the organization. When one person does it, how can another person not take advantage of it? And when one person does it, how do we have enough confidence that that inroads or that side road can have the right level of throughput? That way we can actually go through and use it for other purposes, right? And then how do we kind of auto migrate that up? That whole building an intelligent ecosystem, right, where you have data that helps you derive the way to use new data, I think is completely lacking in this business. And I don't know if we're doing as much in that arena or not, right? So intelligent systems and using AI for BI, I think, is a big one that I see us having a gap in.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you are doing and your experience of building and executing on data product strategies. It's definitely a very important area, one that has been growing in visibility and adoption. So I appreciate the time you've taken to share that with us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Tobias. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other shows, Podcast.init, which covers the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used, and the Machine Learning Podcast, which helps you go from idea to production with machine learning. Visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.